it's morning, midday. We're super excited to host this webinar to share some of our lessons learned, some of our aha moments that we have learned working with organizations developing their equity strategy. And then when they go to implement, they start encountering some resistance and not sure what to do. And so sometimes organizations feel frozen. So really our goal today is to share what we've done. Like, how do you identify those pockets of resistance? How do you know what scenario to anticipate? So we're going to share our process, but we really hope this is a community setting and you can use that chat box and engage with us. Before we jump right in though, we wanted to take a minute and just introduce the team. So my name is Amber Trout from Community Science. Jasmine Williams-Washington and Jiwon Shang will also be joining our time together. Really, we facilitate a lot of organizational effectiveness projects together, and we want to know there's an intentionality that we do when we work together, honoring the racial identities and the social identities we represent. And what does that mean? Even in this webinar, as we're presenting our content, where does power and privilege or lack of show up as we're navigating these necessary conversations? And really for us at Community Science, and I know for Jasmine and I and Jiwon, it's how do we treat organizations as a living organism and understanding that it's a system of people and relationships. And those relationships translate into policies and practices, which brings that vision in place. And for us, it's how do you have the capacity to realize that vision? And when you're realizing the vision, what data and evaluation do you need to have that continuous learning? And for us, that continuous learning also helps with those necessary conversations. So as we'll get into, it's not always about finding the races, but finding the root cause of the resistance that you're coming into. So before we jump in more, I'm going to let Jasmine go for it here and tell us why are we here today? Why are we even talking about resistance to equity? Why are we surprised it's showing up, Jasmine?
Okay, we're going to get there. But before we go there, if you have not done so already, I'm just asking that you drop your name if it does not match your Zoom name, location, and your role in the change process. And what examples, if any, of resistance have you encountered in your work so far? Or what types of resistance do you think you're going to encounter during your time doing this work? So while you all are doing that, and thank you so much, we see them coming in the chat. We really do appreciate the participation. But let's talk about it. All right. We know that resistance is a natural response when we encounter change. It is a natural human response. It's not new. Okay. I'm thinking about how my daughters resist bedtime, right? Come on, parents, you may know, or aunties and every uncles out there. I know that's a bedtime situation and we're talking about equity, right? And I'm sure you're thinking, okay, why does this even matter? If you think about it, resistance is resistance regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. The action and the result can still be the same. So while resistance and equity work can derail your whole process, my kids resisting bedtime can derail my peace in the evening, right? So in those times when my children are resisting bedtime, I am managing their resistance, right? Managing their resistance to get to the ultimate outcome, right? In that case, it's bedtime. In our case, in this work, it's equity, centering equity in the center of your organization. So I understand when we talk about resistance, especially resistance in equity organizational change work, it feels like high risk, and it is high risk, right? Because during these times, resistance can completely derail the process, right? So for today's session, we're going to talk about the different types of resistance, how to identify those things, and then how to better manage the resistance in order to get to the end result that you want. So from your registration, we know that many of you and most of you, quite frankly, are in the planning phase or are in the implementation phase of your equity strategy and feel that you're actively encountering some resistance at this time. So we hope that today's discussion will help you plan for the resistance and manage the resistance once you identify those different things. And that's where we are.
Awesome. What I also want to say is, Jihuan, if you can motion your hand, she's also helping man the chat box. So as we're talking and there's some questions you could put in the chat, and Jihuan will elevate it up because we can't always see when we're in a webinar mode, but we definitely want to hear from you. And Jihuan, what are some of the resistances that we're already seeing in the chat box? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Resistance from staff on continued diversity trainings when they feel that they're already being inclusive.
Yeah, we definitely got a lot of that feeding in. So where we want to go is saying there's resistance to change and resistance to ideas. And so when resistance is emerging, it's not a bad thing. It could be pressure testing a strategy, but resistance to ideas and understanding what's the difference. And for us, our journey together is, what is the context and assumptions? You have a lot of organizations making statements or feel like it's not going too fast or going too slow. Only white people are speaking up, but they're not taking any action, or all the pressure is on people of color to lead the work. It's all over the place. And so with all of those different forms, it's not like resistance stays in one spot. But what we found is helpful is know the resistance, that it's an expression, but not labeling people resistors. And then think about, okay, we'll label the what types of resistance is happening. What are some potential scenarios? And so that's what we'll do. Like, okay, how are different people going to show up as we do the implementation plan? Because one spot that we have experienced is it takes so much energy to get to the implementation plan, to identify if you're going to do diversity training, who is the diversity training, that you're exhausted as an organization. So to have that extra layer to think about what resistance could get in the way as a barrier implementing often is a place where you lose steam, or it's something that you haven't thought about because it's not a one moment thing. It's continuous. So for us, it's like, how do you get underneath resistance? I know when I'm working with someone, I'm like, why? Why do you have to refuse everything that comes out of my mouth? And so I'm reacting when I feel resistance, and I need to check what's going on here. Or you feel, well, there's an effort to stop against or someone. Another way resistance has been defined is the ability to prevent something to happen. And all of these actions, it's unclear what is stimulating these actions that you're feeling, because when you're attached to the outcome, which is advancing equity, the path to get there could look different because you're feeling these emotions. It's like, oh my goodness, we're never going to get to equity. And I definitely am guilty just yesterday of this emotion when working with a client. So for us, is how do you pause, take a step back and go, what's really going underneath? And what's the system-wise way to go, what's my approach? So one, I don't burn out. Two, a lot of you on this call, when you registered, said you're working in a team or at least in pairs. It doesn't always have to be you, because sometimes the burden is too much, or it's the responsibility of the person on the in-group, like me as a white person, to talk to another white person. It really just depends who's the messenger and what is the impact of having these conversations. So we're going to try to hold that nuance as we talk through the different types of resistance. What do we do about them? And how often do we communicate with people that are expressing resistance when we have these reactions like, come on, I don't understand.
Amber, I really love, and I just want to circle back to that. You said do not label people resistors, because resistance is an action. It is not a person, right? Like, it is not that we're labeling people resistors, right? And getting underneath and the why, or what is it that they're actually resisting, and getting to how can we manage it, or how can we continue to move toward that goal. So thank you for that so much. And I just wanted to elevate that one more time. So in managing and identifying resistance, the first step is knowing the types of resistance that exist, right? So I want you to think about, as we move through this list, the types of resistance that you've experienced so far, and think about what category, what type of resistance are you really seeing, okay? So what can resistance look like? The first type of resistance is passive, right? So at first glance, passive resistance can almost come off as agreement, right? So when you hear silence, uh, as a facilitator of these types of conversations, it is my job not to assume that silence equals agreement, right? So in this situation, a passive resistance may look like, hey, I am engaged while we're in the process. When we are in the thick of things, I'm right there with you. But perhaps you have subcommittee work or work that needs to take place outside of that core time that you all have identified. This type of resistance may not reveal the actual work being done outside of the homework time, if that makes any sense. So they're not engaging outside of when we're in full group. That's one type of resistance. Then we have active resistance. Uh, People may be verbal at this time. Active resistance can also show up in a way that you may feel like this type of resistance. Not only are they actively resisting the equity work, but they're also influencing others to bring along with them to stop this process or slow down the process. Typically, during this time, we want to understand, but why? But why? Where is this resistance coming from? It could be that they've been down this road before. Maybe they've been through a very similar situation in another organization, but where is it coming from? But this active resistance is very vocal, is verbal. You're going to know it and you will recognize it immediately. Then next, there's attachment resistance. What does that mean? This resistance shows up in strong arguments, right? And another opportunity to convince others to bring them into the fold and believing that these things are gonna be the way they are, whatever it is, based off previous experience or fear. Right? So in this case, attachment looks like minimizing the issues within the company that as a whole, your change process is trying to impact. And attachment in this case says, hey, we're not so bad at all, right? The whole goal, or one of the goals of attachment resistance, is to maintain the status quo. And when this resistance is happening, these may change slightly, but the big things, the resistance there, they want to hold on and maintain that because it's a sense of safety in some respects. Then there's uncertainty, right? We all know uncertainty. It could be fear of the unknown. It could be, hey, I am just grasping at what I read today, and I'm not sure. Maybe this can also happen. Or I've heard other stories from other people, and if we continue to move through this process, this too can happen to us. Again, this is a very disruptive and can be disruptive situation, but we also need to, again, understand what's underneath that uncertainty, what is feeding that uncertainty. And again, all of these types of resistance will decrease the overall effectiveness of the work that you're doing with the group. Next, we have the overloaded resistance. This is oh my goodness, physical responses, verbal responses. And it's not in a sense where, hey, I want to stop. I want to stop everything that's going on around me, but it's too much. And so how does this resistance show up? It is in your body language. It is in the way you verbalize how you're feeling and how you're engaging at that time. So you may notice people slouching over, hands on heads, moaning, sighing, all these different things because they are overloaded. It is way too much. It can come off as if they're pushing back, pushing against, when it's just too much. It's just too much. And typically, you know that this is an overloaded person if they're coming off as if they're pushing back. But when you ask, hey, what is that I'm seeing? How are you feeling today? There's no specific reason why or anything that really that they can actually verbalize. That's your overloaded resistance. And then we have, last but certainly not least, the resistance that you will not see coming in our conflict entrepreneur. Oh goodness. These other types of resistance, you can kind of see it coming or inching up. The conflict entrepreneur is going to just hit you, completely blindside you. Okay. And this is why this person or this types of resistance may show up very engaged in the process, may be really right in the thick of things, and until they're not. They're with you until they're not. And when they're not, conflict arises everywhere. And sometimes, most of the time, all of the time, it's to their own benefit. It is about profiting in some way or retaining power. Power is a big thing in this work in general, but there's something else that's underneath it, and it could be legitimately the fear of the loss of power. And in this case, the conflict entrepreneur will constantly push back. The conflict entrepreneur is constantly going to set fires around you to derail the process when it's coming. And so again, this type of resistance in the beginning can show up as, hey, this may be a champion for the work. And I'm not saying that to say, hey, you should be suspect of everyone. What I am saying is that when we go into relationships, and we'll talk about that later, it's really important to understand the person as well. Because as we do this work and we move and we want to do organizational change work, it is in fact about changing centering equity in the center of the organization. But the organization is made of the people within it. Okay, made up of the people within it. And so we need to be aware of what's really behind, what's under the resistance that we're seeing. And sometimes all the time it varies, but what we know for sure is that resistance is inevitable. All right. And when managed properly, it can be really helpful for and useful to the process as we're having these conversations while we're facilitating this type of work.
I mean, I find these definitions really helpful as you're walking through, Jasmine. Some of the examples that you all on this call provided, at first it may not feel like clean cut. So one example is there's a lot of people that are unhappy with the leadership, right? And so it's one group saying, hey, leaders, you have to include us in the process. That same group will say, oh, but I can't take it on. So that could be a passive resistor, but it looks like commitment, but there's a fear of saying, actually, I don't have commitment. We'll have another example that came in as this great survey came out with the organization. It showed where the organization could work, what's going well. Leaders are doing some efforts, but there's a difference in how staff of color respond to the survey response and white staff respond to the survey. White staff are responding very publicly, right? That it's an outrage, more needs to be done, oh my goodness, where staff of color are sussing it out and trying to understand, well, why don't I have access to this information? I'm seeing where I don't have access and I'm not going up. So what's really going on? Is it a gatekeeper, or is it a champion, or is it both? So I step back and go, what's really going on? Is it active resistance? So if the group speaking loudest is saying, oh my goodness, this is an outrage on behalf of someone else, and no actions are happening, that's resistance. It can look like support, But if it's about focusing on what behaviors and actions happen after words come out of the mouth, and that's what the navigation really holds. So what I was going to say, Jasmine, what I love you were queuing up too is we all have lived experiences. And so really, we don't know what people have experienced in their life, positive or negative, but that also influences how you show up and how you show up to conflict or even a necessary conversation, which is how we talk about it. Because my background is sweep it under the rug, duck and weave, and don't say anything. And that's how I was raised. Be polite, be quiet, be nice, but never talk about, don't get in touch with your emotions. And that shows up in how I respond to conflict. So we're naming that. But for today, we're really going to stick on applying the definitions, but we couldn't, we felt it was irresponsible not to name that we all have these lived experiences that could be traumatic that inform. And there's that sense of safety is really important to understand when resistance is being expressed, because someone truly may not feel safe. And so the questions aren't, why aren't you buying in? Or why can't you change your behaviors? It's what do you need to be here? And what does that look like to take that new behavior? So knowing when to slow down.
For sure. So I thank you so much for that, Amber. I want to ask the audience, as we, you were thinking about the resistance that you shared in the chat. Where would that resistance fall? What type of resistance are you seeing based off our conversation, these definitions today? And so we're going to launch a poll here. And so what types of resistance are you seeing? Or do you think you're seeing? Amber, I really love that you share, what you're bringing to this, what's underneath, and what you're bringing in to this work. I know you were raised to sweep it under the rug, and I was raised that, hey, what happens in this house stays in this house, right? So in a situation, I can show up very passively, exhibit passive resistance, not because, hey, I really don't want this to happen, because as you mentioned earlier, being resisting or expressing resistance towards equity does not mean you're a bad person. It means that, hey, there's something else I'm responding to. So what's underneath that?
I agree. And that's that component. One of our assumptions going in is what work do you need to do? So many of you are driving the equity strategy or implementation in your work. So what do you need? When do you need to take a time out and pause? And that is a great way to manage resistance. How do you respond to conflict? Who do you go to when you need to just vent or release steam before you engage in that difficult conversation or necessary conversation? I'm just really excited. What is the poll saying? I don't think we could see it from our end.
Let's see. Let me take a look. I'm going to end it right about now. We have pretty good amount of participation. So it looks like most of our guests on the call today are seeing passive resistance. Passive resistance. We have a few attached. The next in line behind passive is uncertain resistance, and then we have active, overwhelmed, and the conflict entrepreneur coming in there, pretty much tying for third place.
Awesome. That is a great reminder to share a guide with definitions for all of the types of resistance that we talked about today will be included after this webinar. So don't feel compelled to have to memorize it all, but definitely a recording too, because we know it's a lot to take in there. But once you know that resistance, I know, Jasmine, when we're preparing to work with an organization, we're always thinking as facilitators, or before I worked at community science, driving the process. I know you also drove a couple processes too in different nonprofits you work for, is when you're preparing for that meeting or that decision, what do you need to think about? There's the decision you need, and then it's how do you get there? So part of planning. So for us, we walk through the scenarios. Like scenario planning is a process and a tool that's during periods of uncertainty. And then you were saying that was one of the resistance that was selected. When you feel it's resistant, you're not sure how the leader's going to respond. We have this equity strategy. What does that mean for everything? Things aren't how they're not status quo. They're not how they always have been. So how do you even think about that? So going from control based, it has to be this way, and getting attached to like terminology, diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, sometimes wanting to see the commitment to the terms forces narrowing of your possible options, rather than thinking about how do I have scenario-based thinking to think what's possible, what are other ways to engage this person that maybe it doesn't understand the point of the equity strategy, maybe they don't see themselves in it, and think about how to shift your team from maybe denial of what's going on in your organization to get clear. Here's the ecosystem of the different pockets of resistance and the possible reasons why. And then which of these forms of resistance are actually helping pressure test our strategy that can enhance it. So for us, it's using these scenarios to focus on less on the concepts, buy into the concepts. And I know a lot of you wrote in about sometimes the concepts and the terminology is diluting the effort, and focusing on what are the behaviors and actions we need to see in people. So using the scenarios, you start thinking, well, what if someone feels overwhelmed in the meeting? What is a way I can respond in real time? How do I get concrete real quick about what you can control and how we can move forward? And so for us, it's really about scoping those relationships, having a necessary conversation or engaging when someone's expressing resistance. And that resistance, again, could be grief or a sense of loss, or this just isn't for me. And that's okay too. How do you scope your relationship so you know where to start that conversation? How do you assess your perceived risk? You know, what is the role of this person in the organization? Can they tank the strategy, or is it someone that just needs to see where they are? What type of communication? How often do I have to talk to someone that is expressing resistance? Because if you're driving the change in your organization, this is what will drain you. If you're focusing and only engaging in resistance and not, as Jasmine always loves to say, filling the narrative that you want to see, then the possibilities start shrinking because you're putting all of your energy in the resistance, where the resistance is being expressed. And then for us, step 3 is, well, what are the potential conversations? How do I enter them? And how frequent will I talk about it? And then try it on, have that conversation, write your reflection, and then update your relationship map and give it a go. Because we know when engaging resistance, it's not one time. And I find when we're working with leaders or even the person implementing, just because the resistance may not be present at this time, it will emerge again. And often when you're trying to figure out how could we get aligned on the behaviors and actions, it's more than one conversation. So the best way we could think of how to be in this with you is jumping in. Let's just start the process. We have a cast of characters we're super excited to introduce you to take us on this journey. And we'll start with step 1.
So step 1, scope your relationships. In this work, we do not talk about relationships and the importance of those relationships enough. So when going through this process, you want to think, 1, what are the relationships that already exist within the organization? And that is from leadership down through staff. And then how do those relationships impact the organization as a whole? We want to know who are the influencers in the organization, who are the champions, who are the drivers, who are the derailers, who are we working with? Right? And we also want to understand, have you been through this before? I know Amber and I, in our work, we realized very early on, it's like, hey, we should really ask and inquire about people's experiences in this work. And what was that like for them? And what did they get out of it, if anything at all? We want to understand those things because relationships are the foundation. We also want to understand, hey, what agreements need to be in place? You know, how does this organization typically work together? How can we create this brave space? Because we all know in this call today that you cannot guarantee safe space, but how can I create a brave space for people? So for those that are not bought into the process, those that are reluctant, those that are um, expressing some resistance, so that we're able to call them in instead of calling out, right? Because one thing is true, especially now, no one wants to be labeled anti-equity. No one wants that label. So the resistance, the type of resistance may not be as active, it may be more passive. But the goal of all of this is for it to have an inclusive process and during this whole thing, right? And lastly, you really want to understand, hey, what is your role? What are you bringing in? I say this all the time in our work. I need to be in relationship with you in order to earn the right to give you advice and be in community with you. Why is that? Because we're asking people, and this work is not easy. And we're asking people to reveal things about themselves that they may be embarrassed about. Uh, in this particular context, in these under these circumstances, resistance can be helpful to this process. It's the conversations that come about as a result of that resistance. So today we're going to meet the cast and think about what types of people can we encounter in this work, and as we move through our as we move through and we understand roles of people. We want to know who's the leadership, who's management, who's the staff, and what are their experiences? What are they bringing to this process, and how can they help drive it? So, for the sake of this conversation, we're going to highlight 3 different categories of people within this organization. We have a leader now. Just for the sake of today, we have a leader who's completely bought into the process. They want to be labeled an anti-racist organization centering equity in the center. And and they want everyone to be on board, and well, not and, but they do not want people to be challenged that they feel uncomfortable. And we all know in this work that people have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and be comfortable with doing things differently, right? So then we have this leader, nice, you're a champion. Hey, they're gun ho. But hey, I'm not too far because I don't want you to upset anyone. And then we have our management.
And the management, knowing, again, building that ecosystem, that living organism of relationships, that the leader's trying to implement this strategy, to have the management team that supports them. So it's 3 managers, and Juan is bought into the process until Jessica negatively responds. So Juan is all about the equity implementation strategy, but if Jessica says her doubts or pokes holes in it, Juan withdraws and doesn't do any work outside the meetings. Terry is another manager. Terry's been appointed to be the driver of the process. They're totally bought in, but recognizes the importance of Jessica's role and Jessica's influence on the leader. Because anytime Jessica makes a body movement or makes a negative comment, it definitely activates our leader to be fearful to move forward, almost overwhelmed on what to do next. Though Terry's doing the work, they also feel unseen because the burden's put on one person because they're not doing it outside. So Jessica, again, finds something wrong every time and finds a way to derail the conversation. So this is the leadership team that's supporting the leader of an organization.
And then we have our staff. Oh my goodness, this staff, everyone supports everyone. This staff focuses on intent versus impact. What do I mean by that? If there is a situation where someone is offended or another staff person said something to offend someone else, we're going to gather around the person that actually caused the harm because it was not their intent. It was not their intent. This staff is relatively diverse of people from various social identities, but there is a sense of camaraderie there and protection, protecting for what we don't know yet. It could be for the reasons that, hey, we're a team and we're going to work together. Or it could be that, hey, I'm not going to speak up quite yet because, hey, this staff person actually provides me cover, right? And even within that, there's these implications of power dynamics run through here. And we're recognizing, I know Amber mentioned this earlier, we're holding that, but today we're focusing on the resistance aspect. But we do recognize that power is a thread that goes all the way through this work. And so, but that's who the staff is. And so we often hear this type of environment being described as a culture of niceness. I don't want to offend you. If I do, I apologize. And that apology is enough, right? So now I mentioned earlier, we really need to understand the different roles, right, for that everyone has, right? So we have influencers, we have supporters, we have champions, we have derailers, and then we have some passive people kind of just around, in the situation. So when we think about Jessica, the management person, in the chat, if you could describe Jessica, where would Jessica fall here? Would Jessica be an influencer? Would she be a supporter? Would they be derailer, passive person, a champion? So I see a derailer in the chat. That was the one bleep that I saw. So Jessica as a derailer.
I'm with you. We'll move.
Yeah, I'm with you. Jessica +1. Thank you. Yes, definitely. We're with you. Jessica is definitely a derailer. What about the leader of the organization? Who are they? Where do they fall in this situation? Would they be a driver, a champion, a driver? They're putting the leader in the driver's seat. Oh, someone said champion.
Yeah.
Yeah. It could be both.
Mm-hmm. See if I could be slip. Nope. I was trying to.
Can you? Okay. And then let's think about Juan. Where would Juan fall in this ecosystem? Supporter.
Yep.
Driver for Juan, supporter. Okay. And what about Terry? Who would Terry be? Where would Terry fall here? Influencer, question mark, champion. Oh, Terry, not Juan. Okay.
Oh. What I like about this exercise is not only do I understand the relationships that I have with people or where I need relationships, do I even know this person to be placing a judgment or expressing my bias on this person, and what's their role in the organization? So as a driver, you're already thinking, where do I nurture and where do I spend my time?
Yeah. But I think something that's important, Amber, is that this map, as you're doing your ecosystem map, that is not one and done. So the people as a part of this process I see some changes over time where one person may also be who was once a champion can kind of move out into a derailer space, or you can have derailers come into a space. in this work, it is really important to understand that we're a human. Everyone is human, and that it is not about forcing a person to comply.
Yeah, that's right. The obey. That's where the scenario planning really happens, not what will happen and has to happen. Because if people obey, what's sustainable about that? It's about how do we be here authentically together and think about what is possible, knowing our vision is to have either a more equitable organization, to have a deeper impact in our community or in the network of organizations we serve. So once you have that scoping, it's understanding, okay, I know where everyone lies currently, and you can move around on that ecosystem, but what is my perceived risk? What is the influence of this person's? And so for us, we map it out. So from left to right on the X horizon, it's what's this person's interest in the equity strategy and implementation and their commitment to the vision your organization is trying to do. And from bottom to top, or the y-axis, is what's the power and influence of this person from low power to high power. Now, power could be informal or it could be formal. And that's really important. So if we're thinking, where's our overwhelmed leader? They're very interested in this strategy and they have high power, right? If we're thinking about staff, there's probably multiple, some that are low interest and low power, or high power and low interest, right? And so for us, we go wherever the person is on the quadrant, that starts informing one, how often do I talk to this person and what type of information do I bring, right? Is it about, hey, do you need clarity on terms, or is here's next steps? So if someone is high power but has low interest, so that could be Jessica, it could be Juan, it's how do you have frequent check-ins and request their input? So you're not checking for understanding of terms, but you're nurturing them along. You're saying, hey, this is where we are in the process. This is an opportunity for you to provide feedback. So you're staying connected because they have the influence in the program, but you're not letting them freeze you up because you want to make sure they understand all the concepts. They'll come when they come, as Jasmine was saying before, they'll move around as the relationships deepens and as it becomes more concrete in your organization. What does equity mean in your organization? It's the concreteness that happens. Now, say you have a low interest, low power person. It could be a leader. It can also be a staff person. That means how do you have consistent communication about the vision and expectation on behaviors? So you're constantly, it could be all staff email, it could be on Slack or Teams or emails. Here's where we're going as an organization. Here's the behaviors that are accepted. So you're calling people in. This is what we want. If you're uncertain, that's okay. Here's the behaviors where we're looking at. So it's consistent communication, but it doesn't necessarily have to be one-on-one, right? So we're conserving our energy because our focus is on how do we have the organism of our company advance equity internally and externally. So then another way, okay, you have high interest but low power. That's where we say organize and build capacity, because there's opportunity there to have demands on the leadership team. So if you organize and the same request is coming from a lot of staff and management, and you build your capacity to have that conversation, actually, we would like to talk about pay equity. Actually, we would like to talk about how we have group norms in every meeting because the way we communicate is violent. So it's putting pressure upwards. So that's you stay engaged and you're thinking how, when I'm communicating to this group, they might be resisting because it's uncertain or they're overwhelmed on their workload, or they really just are not sure, they don't understand the vision clearly. How do you give this group the ability to mobilize? And then finally, that high interest, high power person. This is the person that you help keep focused on the ultimate goal and you're talking with them frequently. And it's because it seems like a big chunk, right? A lot of people are like, I want to end racism or end oppression. Well, that's probably not in our lifetime, right? It's taken over 400 years to build the systems we have, at least domestically in the US. So how do we take a breath, say for what we can influence, hey, let's focus on today. Let's focus on this week. And so your role, if you're the driver, is to show those small steps that keeps building to your bigger milestones. Jasmine, is there anything you want to add on this slide? Because I know we really help us understand where do we put our energy and how we communicate.
Yeah, I just want to, you said something earlier that I just want to elevate again, is that staff, this is not just about leadership and the decision makers, because there may be a staff person that is low power, right? Low power on the decision making side, but high power as an influencer,
Yeah.
where what that person says and how that person shows up really impacts the overall process and how effective that you can be during that time. Again, this is planning, right? This is a planning tool. This is a way to plan on how you're going to manage the potential resistance or the resistance that you're seeing, and also understanding what else needs to happen or what different other types of communication needs to happen. Because as a staff person, if a staff person is low power in the organization, but high power socially, then that engagement looks different, or how we engage looks different. If this same staff person is expressing some resistance, then we know what else needs to happen. And it's about building capacity and having these conversations as well, to move people forward, to move people through this, move people and go on this process and on this journey. I know Amber and I like to say, as we go on this journey with you, and recognizing that we're showing up in a specific way, and recognizing that even still where we are in our equity journeys, we still have growth to do as well. So being very careful about how we communicate during this time, and to what end. So while we're thinking about how frequent the communication is, we do not communicate for the sake of communicating. I am pretty sure that everyone on this call can relate to just getting an email or having a meeting that could have been an email. All right. So being very intentional about what you want to get out of that communication. So even here at the staff level, we see that a risk of the staff, even with that champion, that influencer in the mix, that groupthink can be mistaken for inclusion, right? So because everyone is kind of being passive, having some passive resistance, or exhibiting some uncertainty around this process, it can show up in a way that is not helpful to anyone, nor is it helpful to the organization and the change work. So what do? You focus on the narrative you want to feed. So we recognize that there's uncertainty. We recognize that we have some passive resistance. And we also recognize that there could possibly be some groupthink going on there, where it's being perceived as, hey, everyone agrees with this, when maybe not so much. So how do we communicate with the staff at that point? Because now everyone in this process is important, right? Everyone is important. So the frequent updates that we do, we want to be transparent, because people are uncertain. People are uncertain. People had previous experiences that they're bringing in. So we want to be as transparent as possible, transparent in the communication, transparent in next steps, but also we want to continue to identify opportunities to build their capacity to have these types of discussions, so that the change behavior for the individuals, for the staff level, for the organization, is sustainable throughout. And we know that we have our process of doing this work, DEIB work. We know we're in it too. We get it. What we're saying
Jasmine,
is we have to focus on. Yes, go ahead, Amber. I'm sorry.
no, I just love what you're saying, and I wanted to note, so taking that information, which with those check-ins, as you're saying, and I hear you, transparency is really important. That's also data points to check your strategy,
Yep.
and not always say, just because this person is expressing resistance or may not agree, that like you have to obey. It actually might help the strategy or the tactics that you go about, because you're interacting and you have that the communication, the transparency of information. So that goes to the deep relationships that you were sharing at step one, right? And then also thinking about how do we see different lenses? So for us, once you understand the risk, where is this person's influence, what's going on, how do you map out those potential conversations that you have? So that's step three for us, knowing it's not linear, but how do you start saying for the leader? And Jasmine, you did a great, like jumping us in right into the staff. Who do we need to talk to? We have the leader, we have Jessica, Juan, and Terry, and we have staff. Okay, so now we have our ecosystem, it's in our table. And what's the risk that you feel, or maybe the team that you're working together, so you have those we solutions to say, what are we fearful of if this conversation goes sideways? It's thinking about, oh, the leader might pull funding from the equity work if they can't see what to do next. So then you're thinking, okay, this is that overwhelmed resistance. We've seen it before. We know what to do. Be clear on those action steps and show the leader what they have control over. So to show the actionable steps, the communication need is weekly. So then you're going, okay, this is our favorite, Jasmine, taking on the managers. What is the way to approach the managers? And they're not a monolithic. We have three people that we're thinking about that we're holding in this ecosystem. And there's definitely two that we have here. We have one, might be a gatekeeper, won't release time, right? We might see the support in the leadership meetings, but when it comes to letting staff participate or pilot processes, it's a no-go. So this person might be attached to who they were. They're the go-to manager. They're allowed to call the shots. They're used to being in charge. So they're attached to that identity. So when I'm thinking about, ooh, how do I interact with this person? It's how do I have fresh ideas? Remember, we both agree that we want equity this way, or we want staff to feel they have the same access to opportunities as anyone else. It's not determinant of your social identity or your racial identity. So, okay, how do you get them there? So perhaps it's a weekly virtual conversation to keep the relationship going and help that person take that journey. Compared to it could be Juan, who's the kind of disrupts that thinking. Maybe we'll burn out leadership because it's always about what if all these things are going to go wrong, so much that boom, the organization frees up. So as Jasmine keeps telling us, is focus on that narrative you want to feed and the culture you want to grow. So that could be, how do you have a relationship with this person, but be intentional. You don't have to spend all your time here, because it's like, yeah, I totally hear what you're saying, and here's the behaviors and the direction we're trying to go. And you give them their point of feedback and input, and you keep moving along. So Jasmine, when you're filling up this table, is there anything else you wanted to share?
What's not represented in this table is the power dynamics that is through here. So again, I just want to acknowledge that there are power dynamics with here that exist here, just not discussing those at this time. But what I want to say is this is a process that goes over and over and over again. That spreadsheet's going to change, your maps are going to change, the people and how they show up will change. And so you engage in those conversations. You have the necessary conversations. Then you reflect what went well, what did not, who's showing up differently, who is not, who is taking on the narrative that we want to feed, who's not, what additional work needs to be done, and most importantly, how can I show up differently? What else do I need to offer to this situation so that we move this process forward? Then we build capacity, right? We build capacity again to have these conversations, because again, resistance, when not managed, can derail this process when not managed. Resistance can be healthy for everyone involved in this process, where people are learning, people feel more comfortable or feel comfortable in what they're saying and feel heard. Amber mentioned earlier the norms and the importance of norms and having norms and sharing norms. in this work. And so what are we doing? What are the changes that are taking place that we see individually with people? And then what changes do we see in the group with people? So we want to continue to move this forward. Again, it's a cycle. It's never ending. We're going to keep going. So in our last 4 minutes, and wanting to be respectful of everyone's time, we do want to thank you so much for joining us today. And we want to say, hey, we hope today, or if you have any questions, that you can follow up with myself or Amber directly as well if you had any questions, or you want to share your experiences. And we appreciate all the feedback that you all have given in the chat. But the key takeaways for today is, one, take time to understand the root cause of the resistance being expressed. Okay, be strategic. Be strategic in this process, not attached. It's not being attached to these concepts or a specific framework. It's about feeling in your body and giving the response that you feel the group needs at the time. Sometimes we're in a situation where we're not centering content, we're centering time, because we just have to get through it. Then stay focused on the ultimate goal. What is the end goal? Again, what's in your body and what you're feeling is very important. And as we do this work all the time, we recognize that sometimes we cannot necessarily verbalize what we think needs or why something needs to happen, but we feel it in our bodies because of the relationships and the mapping that we've done. We actually feel it. And like I say all the time, your gut is a source of data. Follow your gut, okay? Remember, a human connection is everything. The intention will take you much further in this process. And don't be afraid of the necessary conversations, or some call it uncomfortable conversations. And again, we will provide some resources following this training or this webinar today, in addition to also the slides. So thank you so much for your feedback. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope to see all of you soon.
Take care.